Welcome to this Autism Ontario webinar, When the Navigation Starts. Parents coming to understand their child has autism, with Stephen Gentles, postdoctorate fellow at Autism Ontario and McMaster University, a first-timer on our desk. Stephen, thanks for joining us. We are here today to discuss a study and some papers that have recently been published by Stephen and a group on this topic. So if you look in the resources section, you will find that there are two open access links, meaning that, it's not, you don't have to pay for it or anything, to two papers that came out of the study. One, the red study, or the focus view. This is what we're going to really be diving into today. And there is also one that outlines a broader view. It was published first, and it gives some context to the study. Before we dive in, I've got some housekeeping items for you, as I always do. Throughout this presentation, there will be slides that we will be going through. They inform our conversation. You can download them in both English and French in the Resource Center. There are also other items like these studies that are available in the Resource Center. I'll talk about those from time to time. My only real job here is to keep the conversation going with Stephen and to get your questions answered. And so you can submit your questions at any time, and they'll come up to me here at my iPad, and I will aspire to get them answered throughout the webinar. There's way too many of you and way too many questions generally to get them all answered. And so in some way, we will look to try to get these questions answered for you afterwards through the team at Autism Ontario, Stephen, and the like. And finally, if you have any issues at all with the technology, you can go ahead and you can click on the help icon. Okay. That was a mouthful, and now that I've gotten through that, it's time for me to step back and welcome Stephen. And Stephen, before we dive into the data, this is a study that started for you, so I understand, many years ago. Can you talk to me a little bit about its origins and what the study included?
Yeah. So although that most recent paper was published just in September 2019, the study was kind of a long time, took a long time to do the data collection and analysis.
Well, it's quite a big study, I see, for qualitative research, right? We had 45 in-depth interviews, it looks like.
That's right, yeah. So it stems from my program of research, which is on supporting and understanding parents of kids with autism, right. Specifically how they navigate intervention or engage in care. Okay. So I'll use those terms kind of interchangeably. And so the study is basically, the primary data for it were 45 interviews with Ontario parents and professionals. Right. And the parents varied widely in their kind of perspectives in terms of their geographic location, their socioeconomic status, as well as how old their child was at the time of the interview.
At the time of the interview, right. Okay. So we know that parental engagement and involvement is important. We know it so well here on the desk because we talk about it all the time at different aspects of it. But I want to hear from you. Why do you think that this is an important topic right now?
Yeah, well, right now is the key word, I think. Yeah. If we think about some of the context that has led to more and more involvement of parents in the care related to autism. So one of the trends is this phenomenon of family-centered care, and that was kind of a reaction to the previous model of just treat the child and keep the parent out of the way. And at some point, some smart people realized that parents have a lot of information about their child and expertise to contribute to improve care and even improve outcomes. Right. As well, there's in autism, parent-mediated interventions are kind of a recent innovation where parents are actually involved in delivering and implementing some of the therapy. And that has the benefits of generalizing some of the child learning to the the home and other environments, as well as strengthening the parent-child relationship, which is the key relationship in the child's life.
Yeah.
So lots of advantages, but it ultimately requires a lot of time and energy for
the parents
to participate in.
And I think that this is very timely, or I imagine that it is as well, due to the changes in the direct funding model announced by the provincial government, right?
That's right, yeah. So earlier this year, many parents know very well the change that came. So the underlying change was that parents are given a budget to choose the services for their child.
Right.
So the idea behind this, and it's not unique to Ontario, the direct funding model. In Canada, we have Alberta and British Columbia, as well as Australia to look to as places that have already moved to a direct funding model.
Right.
So the reasoning behind it is to give parents and families more choice and into what treatments they think are needed for their child. So as well as choice, though, it gives responsibility for making all the decisions about what therapies to buy with a budget, as well as often putting parents in the position of being the accountant and even the employer for the workers.
Right, and before we start blowing out my iPad, Stephen or myself are experts on the direct funding program from the Ontario government, nor the changes that are occurring. And so what we're going to focus on and what we're going to get into here, which is really neat because I've been through the content before with you, is I see a lens, and for parents out there, it's going to give you an idea, I think, of what you are going through today or what you have already gone through. And for any of you that are, doctors or professionals, a lens into what these parents are going through at this very important time. It's on this slide, but as we talk about these changes, and you talked about these great responsibilities, we need to discuss the readiness of the parent, right? That's
right. There hasn't been much attention to, given all these increased demands on parents, how much capacity they have to take them on at different points in time. So this is particularly important early when we're involving parents close to diagnosis, because we know that's when parents are generally most burdened.
Yeah.
As well, parents are different from each other, so some parents will have more needs than others.
Yeah.
And even within the same parent over time, they'll have points of time where they have more or less capacity and motivation to meet those demands. So all of this has implications for the kinds of supports that we give to parents, and how we go about involving them, I think, in order to avoid overburdening them with too many demands. Okay, so we talked this whole presentation, we got involvement, engagement, care, intervention, words that mean, they might mean different things to different people. So I want to, before we dive into how it works, define it for us. Talk about what it means when you say these words. Yeah, so to nail down involvement or engagement, I'm using them kind of interchangeably. I'm referring specifically to engagement in care or engagement in intervention, not engagement in parenting, which is another topic that's pretty important in autism. So engagement in care involves a suite of different activities, many activities such as researching, advocating, scheduling, even implementing intervention, as we talked about. And this collection of activities is generally larger than it is for a lot of other patient groups who have to engage in their own care. So the role and the burden for parents already is quite high based on these responsibilities. So the last one, readiness. You've got an interesting slide here. What do you mean by readiness? Yeah, so our goalie here is in the ready position, and a lot of sports have the ready position, which is why I chose it. But in addition to that, we can think about, for example, if this is a game situation, his level of arousal is probably really high, which means his mental and emotional level of motivation for tackling whatever comes at him is quite high. In addition, he looks quite professional. He's probably done lots of training that give him the skills and the physical ability to be able to handle his role. So we can kind of translate some of these ideas to parents of kids with autism who, as we've said, have a quite a role to fill.
But the difference, as you've already laid out here, is this guy, started training probably when he was 9 or 10 years old, likely, and as he got older, that training progressed and progressed and progressed. He's in his 20s, probably in this photo, and has been not only preparing his whole life for this game and this shot, but likely preparing all week for this player and this shot. That's a lot of preparedness to be ready. Mm-hmm. Parents we're talking about find out that their child's been diagnosed, and now they go through a process. And that's what this is let's face it, it's an academic-looking slide. It's a nicely done design. But this, I think, is what you found in speaking to parents was how their process around getting ready, if you will. So talk to me about what this means. Yeah,
and I like how you described that, because some of this can be maybe related back to that image of the goalie. So one of the strengths of this study is that it looked at things from parents' perspective. So that makes it, I think, a bit more useful to clinicians and professionals to understand things from parents' perspective. So this was a model from the first paper that talks about, seeing things from parents' life world, which is not just in the clinic, but a lot of what they're doing navigating intervention happens outside of that. And all of their action is driven by, concerns, and there can be multiple different concerns in autism, from specific concerns like speech to the general overarching concern of autism itself. So if you want to understand any action, or if a professional wants to understand any action of a parent engaging in care, the place to go for understanding is their meaning making, and that's what those 4 things in the middle are about. And I think a lot of parents could relate to them, including what the parent does to inform themselves. For example, when they're just learning how to learning about the fact that their child has autism, what information sources do they go to? That they observe their child as things go. They might talk to people, in their family or acquaintances, other parents, the internet, professionals, as things go along, multiple different sources. So it's a process. And then seeing what's involved. That's like the goalie going from when they started playing at age 5 to a high. As they get more experience navigating services and running into barriers, and they understand what this new role is about as a parent, and then defining concerns. The biggest example of that is coming to understand the child has autism, which I'll talk about more, and then adapting emotionally to the numerous challenges that kind of define the role. So understanding all of this gives you a comprehensive understanding of how parents' motivation increases over time.
You talked about how some of the people in the study were parents who had the diagnosis 18 years ago, and some that got the diagnosis only 2 years ago or whatever it might have been. With the changes in the world, did you find that those who were more recently diagnosed had a higher information, like they were more aware of autism than the others were at the start, or Or did that not come out in the study?
Yeah, so if I were to talk about what they remember knowing at the time, when they're just going about things, there was some indication that, back for the earlier cohorts, if you will, the informational kind of landscape was a bit different and not. But ironically, all parents all the way through often, or not all, but many referred to that movie with Dustin Hoffman as their first picture of autism, Rain Man.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's a reference that I make often when talking to people as well, because most people of my generation remember Rain Man, which was a great movie. Well, I'm glad that it seems like there was more information, because that's what we're trying to do here on this desk, and at Autism Ontario, a big thing is providing that information. This next graph is an interesting one, and it's a trajectory of readiness and motivation. What is this outlining about the parent?
Right, so that cycle of meaning making and action, that actually helps explain how parents' level of motivation and readiness changes over time. So in this case, it's over a period of 6 years, and this is a kind of a stylized, hypothetical trajectory of one parent's changing readiness for involvement over time. And if you put together what all parents said in the interview, generally, the beginning is when there's very little readiness, very little knowledge, very little understanding what the role is, and that corresponds to the process of coming to understand the child has autism. And then within that process, parents' readiness starts to increase.
Well, I see readiness dropping off. Is that a bad thing? It looks bad to me. I don't know. It's going down after a bit. So is that a bad thing?
That's a good question, and it's not a bad thing.
Okay.
To talk about the longer term process, parents themselves describe that early part of being at a very high level of activation or readiness for. They're doing all they can, and they're going on all cylinders. The analogy they use is going at sprint pace. And then after a few years, parents will get exhausted. They can't keep that up. And so they see a need for balance, and then they kind of settle down into, it's still a lot of work they're doing, but it's maybe marathon pace. It's going fast, but at a more sustainable pace.
That's what I was going to say. It has to be sustainable for everyone, right? We have our first question from the audience, an interesting one. So this comes from a concerned grandparent. My grandson is exhibiting some of the red flags for autism, but my daughter disagrees. How do I encourage her to get this assessed? So sometimes these hypothetical questions are a little challenging for our experts to answer, and you're not actually a clinician, but in your best assessment, what do you think? If a daughter disagrees but someone else recognizes it, what do you think they should do to encourage these getting assessed?
Well, that's a very good example, and you'll probably by the end of the presentation be able to kind of have an idea. It's a very personal thing, obviously.
It is, yeah.
You'll be able to maybe place where she is as a mother on this kind of continuum, and everybody's different, and everybody has different reasons for. People have different amounts of knowledge or information that they're going on to have their position, whether they suspect their child has autism or not. So rather than give advice, maybe I'll pass on the rest of the question, and hopefully there'll be more understanding by the end of this talk. But that's a really good example of how parents can be at different parts on the path if the child has autism.
Right.
We don't know red flags. Don't mean that the child has autism.
Right, and there's not knowing anything else other than that you're a caring grandparent who's done something very very good is that you're here today. So you've likely been to learning.autism.com, or you've been to the Autism Ontario website and you've seen other items. And if not, what you will find is that there's a number of pre-early intervention in this type of situation. There's a number of things that go into it, like race and culture and a bunch of stuff. And there's been webinars that we've done on all of these things. And I think that what is, no spoilers for this presentation, but what comes out a lot is that knowledge is power. And if you can direct your daughter to, one or two of the presentations that are here, maybe this one, it might help them gain understanding of why it's important to be assessed and assessed early. But let's move on with what we're here to talk about today. So we got this big arc, right, at the start. So talk to me about how their motivation for engagement grows from being flat, 0 to 60, it looks like, is what happens. So how does this occur? Yeah.
So I'll go through what that second RED study was about.
Okay.
Which...
So just a reminder, this RED study is the deep dive, and it's available in the resource section, ungated. You can go and check that out.
So coming to understand the child has autism can be accounted for by 4 steps. And these are optional steps, meaning that not all parents have to go through all 4 steps.
Right.
So I'll go through each step.
Yeah.
But as I go, try to pay attention to how parents, not just their certainty of autism might change. And these, again, were all parents who ended up with confirmation that their child had autism.
Right. Okay.
That was a criteria of participating. Pay attention also to how their level of urgency, how their level of worry, and therefore urgency, and therefore motivation also increased.
Right.
And what they were using information for, how that changed over time, and also finally what their action was focused on doing, because it all changes and helps explain how
we get up the curve.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first one is forming an image of difference.
Yeah, so that's where the parent starts to, as many parents might, regardless, notice some signs in their child that makes them think, my child is a little different.
Right.
But there's not really any level of worry to speak of, at least not enough to trigger, dedicated action. So the parent will just proceed by casually observing their child and make comparisons with other children, other parents' children. So this is a quote that's a really good example of that and how it maybe transitions to the next step. But I'm not going to read
all those quotes. And those quotes are good. We may read some of them, but they're good. But they're available when you download the full deck from the resource center. So we got some of to use our grandparent as a case study, some red flags or some things that they start watching for. And I guess that what you're saying here is after they've seen that, viewed that for long enough, now they start to question the signs.
Right, they start to question the signs. And it's the caregiver who's closest to the child who I was talking to.
Right.
They're in the best position to observe most about the child and use the child as an information source through this process. So at this step, there's a bit of a suspicion that something is actually wrong.
Right.
And so there's a low level of worry, and the action is to actually, formally record observations in a lot of cases, as well as to seek more information about what these signs might mean. And the purpose of that information is to define whether there's a problem and whether information might be needed.
Okay. And so they've done this and, come to the conclusion that something's wrong. Not developing like other children, not looking me in the eye, whatever it might be. Right. So this has got to be a big for parents, right? Like this point right here.
Exactly. This is a big step. Any parent who's suspected that their child has a developmental problem can understand that the level of worry is high. This affects your child's future.
Yeah. Up to this point, they're kind of probably hoping it will improve, right? That they're
right,
yeah.
right. And at this point, that's a very good point. They see that, no, this is real. There's a real problem. They haven't necessarily understood what the problem is. They might have ideas. So the level of concern is urgent,
right.
and the action that they take is more emphatic. So there's more insistent looking for information, where that information is specifically to identify what the problem is that
right.
they know exists and what intervention will be needed. So they'll actually seek help from professionals, and this is where some of the emotional adaptation really starts.
Right. And then we're talking to people clearly who have a fourth step, and that fourth step is reaching certainty. Yeah.
So quite often parents reach certainty on their own, independent of getting a diagnosis, through their own integrating of signs with information that they might seek from other sources. And in some cases, parents will run up against a professional who suddenly delivers the information that their child has autism.
Yeah.
So here, in either case, there's again a strong sense of urgency,
right.
To take action, to actually do something,
yeah.
To try to make the best of the fact that their child has autism. Often parents still don't have a clear understanding of what autism is, so there'll be a need for lots of information seeking to understand how to adapt to it, in addition to what
yeah.
to do.
Seeing this process firsthand, I'm not a clinician. You guys all know who've been here before. I'm just a moderator, a lowly moderator, but firsthand with a family member and stuff. And it's crazy that moment. You think they thought about it, they convince themselves somewhat, but it's still different when they're told. And the moment that they're told, it just goes full blown. Every day and every night is about how do I get the best help possible? How do I, and the contacting and learning so much. And it's crazy that, because I walk around and I talk about doing this job of moderating, and I bring up to friends, family members, folks who are, my age and whatnot, and I'm shocked at how many people don't understand it. And I'm not the right person to describe it to them, but I do see quite often this feeling that that it's just very much a misunderstood diagnosis for a lot of people, and. Before we move on to where we're going to go with this, there's a question that came in right after we did those, but I think it is important. As they go through all of this, and this person is wondering if my concern about the readiness kind of going down as a downward slope. Do you think that that's related to acceptance to a certain extent? I was thinking it might be related to the fact that by getting all of that information, they now can level set. But why do you think that there's any other variables other than you can't sprint the whole way that has that readiness kind of tail off?
Yeah, so acceptance can mean different things. One is accepting the possibility of autism in the first place. That is something that generally happens quite early on. You can't be certain it's autism unless you've accepted the
right.
possibility of autism in the first place, and there can be.
But once you've accepted, I think in this case, you've got the acceptance. That acceptance happens. You go and seek, you get the diagnoses, and then you're in the sprint, right? And then when you've accepted, I guess, the life that, or whatever, you accept that this is going to be part
right.
of your life.
The new future. Yeah. So yeah, that's actually a big part of the adapting emotionally part
right.
that is in the papers. It's releasing culturally defined hopes for the future, and accepting at this point, because parents don't know much about it, an uncertain and potentially fearful future, depending on the information or the idea of autism that parents start out with.
Right.
So we'll talk about how that varies in a few slides,
right.
but for many parents, the first reaction is fearful, but it doesn't have to be.
No, it doesn't. Okay, so we're going to switch gears. Oh, this is one you wanted to read, I think, right?
No, actually, no.
No, sorry, my bad.
Yeah.
My bad. You guys can read it. Download it and read it. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. A lot of this study is very, again, is a lens that clinicians can pull a lot from. So in your mind, in going through this, what do professionals, what can they learn from this family-centric care?
Yeah, so I think there's some kind of straightforward clinical implications. One is for professionals of any type to be sensitive to parents at the point of contact, where they are, where they may be in this process of coming to understand their child has autism. And something to look for is their level of motivation and urgency as an indicator of how ready they are to engage in care. For parents who are not ready, obviously reduce the demands that you might be placing on them to engage in care. Yeah. And something that parents talked about throughout the 4 steps was a number of different barriers, not just external barriers, but internal ones that included denial, which happens early on, and then grief that kind of happens in the last two steps, I'd say. And so grief is something that I think we should talk about a bit more, even though it was a small finding of the overall study.
Right. And did you find, anecdotally or not, was it, did a lot of people go through that process of denial first and then grief? Like they went through a denial where they didn't think that their child was, and then when they found out, they got the grief? Or is it a one or the other kind of feeling, do you think?
Yeah, denial logically has to happen before grief, because you can't know that your child has autism until you've moved past denial of the possibility that they have autism. And then once, or even a serious developmental problem, then once you reach that point of understanding, that's when sometimes grief can happen.
I'm going to jump back to a question because it's timely, and then we'll move on to the next thing. And this is interesting because we talk a lot about the steps that the parents go through, and we had one grandparent in, or extended family member in, who seemed to be at a different stage than their child. This happens a lot. And this question is, I have a child who was diagnosed with autism 3 years ago, but the extended family is in denial. Do you have suggestions about how I can help them understand the diagnoses? Yeah,
all I can say is this is an issue with a number of families, and a number of families talk about it as one of the difficult issues of going through the process. And without doing a dedicated study on that topic, I don't have advice to give, but just that you're not alone in that, I guess.
Yeah. So I have the same answer to almost every one of these questions. Knowledge is power and understanding, and oftentimes our extended families care so much about us and that, and then they don't want to accept this. But you have been through these stages, and you are here today, so you have a good understanding, or a decent understanding, I would imagine, of autism in general and autism spectrum disorder. And so everything we do on this desk at Learning, and that's posted on the learning.autismontario website or at Autism Ontario, is information that is open to the public. It is open to your friends and family. It is open to your clinicians, which this one's a good one to get into your clinician's hands. It's open to everyone, and there's a lot of really good pieces of information there that you can share. And again, I've said it before, the more people that come through this program who have an association with a child on the spectrum in the province of Ontario that watch these webinars, that do that, helps us get more funding, helps us do more sessions like this and bring folks like Stephen in and help him. Grief, denial, two big things that keep coming up. We have a clinician on who says that they have a client who is feeling very overwhelmed by their child's diagnosis. So they're in that moment. Do you have suggestions about how to support the parent through the grieving process? What the clinician can do, if you will?
That might be one of the last messages that I'd like to get to, actually.
Sure.
So parents in their grieving, that's often, sorry. One of the things that can help are, as you say, information as power. And that was one of the findings of the study, was that parents who knew more about autism earlier on seemed to be better equipped. And by being better equipped, they either didn't grieve or grieve for a shorter period of time.
Right.
So one of the things in the literature is how there aren't really any examples of positive or even neutral responses of a parent first learning their child has autism.
Okay.
And this is a problem because it leads to a kind of an unfortunate perception that the standard response to finding out your child has autism is for parents to generally all grieve.
Right.
And that's simply not true, and it wasn't what I observed in my studies. So in my study, sure, some parents did grieve, and they described having very good reasons for grieving. But there were other parents who definitely did not have that intense period that usually lasted a few weeks of grieving. And in fact, the next slide
goes well into that.
Yeah, so there is a full range. So if at one end of the range you have grieving, what's the other end of the range? And that's why this mother's example is such an important one.
Yeah.
So she started off in the position of probably having a more complete picture of autism than many parents do at that early point, because she had a brother who had Asperger's. So she describes her response as follows, and I'll read this quote. So it was joy. And I know that that's a very backward for a lot of people, but I absolutely adore my brother. I mean, he's at university doing his master's right now and was accepted to the doctorate program for engineering. He's decided not to do it, but he's a very intelligent man and surpassed all kinds of barriers that service providers and doctors had sort of said would be in place. So right away, my view of autism is very different than a lot of people's. I've talked to friends who would say, I'd be devastated if my child had autism. And I'm like, why? Because to me, it's not as much of a barrier as it is to others. So it was joy because I absolutely delight in my brother. He's an absolutely amazing person and makes me laugh right, left, and center. And so I thought, I'm going to have one of those? I'm going to have a boy like that? This is awesome.
Wow, that is a pretty powerful statement, and this leads into something I've heard many times here on the desk.
Oh, good. Yeah. So specifically, why her example is so important, I think, really comes out in Jim Sinclair's now famous speech, "Don't Mourn for Us."
Yeah.
So Jim Sinclair is an autistic advocate who is kind of known for his contribution to some of the ideas behind the neurodiversity movement. So in his speech, his main point is that grieving, sure, but it can be taken too far or promoted unnecessarily, and that's because for a parent who grieves, they're grieving of the picture of the child that they kind of were expecting.
Right.
And so in a sense, there are two children. There's that child, and then there's the autistic child that they still have right in front of them for the rest of their life, who is deserving of love and has value. And it's a matter of shifting from letting go of that image and embracing the child that you actually have. So if this doesn't happen and the grieving goes on too long, then you can imagine that it would do a bit of damage to the child's self-image, as well as the relationship between the parent and the child.
The other thing I like about that quote is, now, every day, we are hearing more and more about adults in the public eye doing amazing things who are openly discussing the fact that they are on the spectrum. And I think that probably those parents, going back to the early cohorts of the program, those parents were likely folks who never had that example to point to, that person outside of Rain Man in the movie. And so, you know, for parents who don't have that brother who's that amazing person who can have joy when they get the diagnoses, there's a lot more people, successful people, amazing people who have changed the world that you can point to, who we now know are on the spectrum and have discussed being on the spectrum. So outside of the fact that we don't want to grieve too long because there's some negative effects, grieving it's necessary for some, right? It's part of the process.
Right, yeah. So yeah, we certainly don't want to judge parent, and I would hope that nobody comes away from this judging parents who do grieve, because every parent starts from a different point, and there are lots of good reasons that parents talk about for why they grieve, and it depends on, you know, their prior images and understandings of things. One thing that seemed to help, as I said, was having a more complete picture of autism, and so those pictures of adults that we're seeing more and more. Yeah. Would contribute to a more balanced idea of autism. So this is where the idea of strengths, you know, presenting strengths-based, we're talking about autism in a strengths-based way, such as using the ideas of neurodiversity, have potential to be helpful to parents right at that early stage.
Our clinicians know exactly what you mean when you say presenting, you know, positions of neurodiversity, and I think I got it from what you just said. But when you're recommending that to other clinicians, what do you mean when you're using that word neurodiversity?
So neurodiversity, first of all, I would say don't quote somebody who's not autistic as being an expert on neurodiversity.
Okay.
The experts, I would say go to the experts as go to autistics who've written about neurodiversity as more as the authorities on what neurodiversity is. Yeah. But it's seeing that there's a spectrum of ways that people can legitimately exist in terms of how they're wired. Yeah. So there is value to being wired in a way that we see as is autism, but that's not to say that there isn't disability that comes with autism. Neurodiversity also accepts that there are disabilities, and a lot there are ways to accommodate that we should be accommodating for the challenges of that form of difference, I guess.
In your research, were you able to, and sometimes people are remembering this, and not everyone defines grief the same way, but did you have find any sort of average length of time that parents were in the grief state?
It seemed in the kind of small sample I had to be a few weeks. Parents would talk about.
So that's not very long, really.
No,
yeah.
No.
And then it was right about, you go through a few weeks, and then it was about the action, right? That's when we started going up the curve and finding and understanding.
Yeah. So people had accepted, you know, that their child had autism or a developmental problem, but they were overwhelmed at that point and could not engage until they had, you know, made it through that intensely painful time, and then they were able to engage more with more energy, I guess.
This next question I'm going to answer because I think it's for Autism Ontario. What resources do they have in place to help parents navigate the system easily? It was a pain navigating the system. Yes, I think this is something that we all know. Anyone who's been through it, we understand the pains of navigating the system, and that's one of the main jobs of Autism Ontario, is to help you. The system is changing. It's changed this year, and it changes all the time. And we understand that there's, not as many supports as we would all like. And so this process that Stephen has laid out, as well as the process of interventions and the myriad of different types of interventions, it is not easy to navigate. In saying that, there are Autism Ontario provides a lot of resources in print, in on the website, in these videos, but also they have people in the community that their job is to help you navigate things. They know about programs that are not easily found, and you can reach out to Autism Ontario if you've not done so already to help. Outside of that, I don't know if you have any other ideas around the toolkits for navigating?
Yeah, well, specifically, I was going to refer parents to this today now, the service navigation program that Autism Ontario does to help parents navigate what are now known, or navigate the direct funding model. And
which you can't navigate without that now, right? Like, that's the world that we do live in.
Right. So there's information on the website about how to register for the service navigation program. So any parent of a child can do that.
Okay. This person has a 2-year-old who believes they may have autism or may be on the spectrum. How early is too early for a diagnosis? You know?
Their diagnoses are made as, my understanding, I'm not a clinician, is as early as 18 months.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you could definitely start exploring getting a referral, or maybe self-referring if there's if you can find a place to self-refer. Checking out the red flags. There are a lot of ways that parents kind of increase their suspicion that way. So
I mean, if we look at the process here that you outlined, I mean, the person is here, so they're in that stage of seeking information. And if you're new to it, try and get that, if you believe it and you've gone through it, try and get that referral early, because it can take some time to go through that process to get the diagnosis, and you need that to get the assists and the various other things that we talk about. So, good information. In your study, or in any of your studies, did you encounter anybody with a late diagnosis? So, we question here about someone who's got a 16-year-old who they believe today may be on the spectrum. They're here today learning, and are even wondering at this point with a child of that age if they should look to pursue a diagnosis. What are your thoughts?
My study, the late diagnoses tended to happen at even younger than 16,
okay.
And it was maybe there are some cases where it wasn't classic autism,
right?
That might be harder for parents to kind of, would take parents longer to kind of recognize and go through the process to finally reach certainty. However, now diagnoses are happening into adulthood. So outside of my study, it's not uncommon, and there are lots of stories out there. And I think support for people in the community of people who've been diagnosed late.
When we did a women in autism on the desk, we had 3 women on the spectrum, or 2 women on the spectrum and a clinician, and we talked through the fact that many women over the past couple decades, as boys were being diagnosed, were not, due to a myriad of factors, and they went, seeked out, and got their diagnoses, I think, in their 20s or 30s. And that is not evidence-based like what we've been talking about today. That is anecdotal to people when they were here. But they're getting a diagnosis even that late in life made them so happy that they could point a finger at and start to understand themselves better. And so with a 16-year-old child who clearly, if you weren't sure, is at a certain end of the spectrum, it'll probably be a good thing if you get that diagnosis, just in having him and you understand the few things that are slightly different, or what can sort of be done. So We've got one more question, and that is from, I think, pretty much a good target part of our audience today, and that is, as a clinician in the field, I found this presentation to be very helpful. It's a big question. But if you were to surmise, what are the top 3 takeaways from this study that they should bring back to their team? What would you think those are?
I would kind of plug into the clinical implications part, which ultimately point to, I guess, the 2 barriers of grieving and denial and grieving,
right,
as kind of obvious points from the findings of this study as places where you can tailor supports to parents
right
better. If you can figure out how to address those 2 problems, then I think that would be a great way to support parents. The other overall suggestion is that in terms of where to focus support in autism, parents need it most at the beginning.
Yeah.
Then they start to engage on their own, and sometimes they engage too much, and that's
right.
another issue. Maybe there's a need to encourage parents to seek balance when they're kind of going at sprint pace.
Yeah.
But early on is when I think support needs to focus on the parents. There's mental health problems. There's other problems that marital. There's all kinds of issues that are most acute at the beginning, and then maybe you can let the parent focus on supporting the child.
And I will add to that, because it seems to keep coming up, is the information side of it. And as clinicians, there's a lot of information out there. I don't know if there's a lot of conflicting information, but when a parent gets the diagnoses in this day and age, the first thing they're going to do is go to their phone and start Googling the crap out of stuff in their car on the way home before they even get home, and they're going to be Googling. And sure, Autism Ontario is there's a lot of great places for it, but if you can, even help them navigate, where to get the right pieces of information. And Autism Ontario has tried to do that by setting up the information that they deliver in different life stages. But if you can help point them in the right direction to where they can learn, all of the evidence of the studies dictates that the more educated they are on the topic, the less that grieving stage is, the better they move on to the other stages of this where they can be helpful and be involved in the interventions that are required. Before we go, is there anything that we didn't touch on today that you want to make sure our audience hears, your moment of zen, or any takeaway items?
I think it's been a great discussion, and some of the questions were great at kind of highlighting some of the findings. So,
yeah.
So I'm fine with what we've talked about. Thanks.
Great, yeah, and I think that clinicians can even definitely can take something from the questions that came in from the audience too on where people's heads are at. So with that, that's all the time that we have today. Any questions that were not answered, we will aspire in one way or another to get you those answers. This presentation, like all of our webinars, will be available tomorrow on learning.autism Ontario or on the Autism Ontario website, so you can check out both those resources. It is open to the public. They just need to sign in to view, and that's important because this is a great presentation for any of you parents to share with clinicians that you are working with, who you maybe believe are not fully understanding of your children. It's also one that I think helps a lot of parents understand what it is that they are going through. And for our very, very selfish reasons, the more people connected to autism that come to these, the more that get the education that we put forward, the more we can do for the community, and the more great speakers like Stephen we can bring here on the desk. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for all of your participation, the great questions, and the time you were here today. Stephen, thanks for coming in. Happy Halloween, and we'll see you next time at